King David, a man after God's own heart, had just lost his child. Now, while David did like any other parent would do, he grieved, and he grieved hard. He wept, he repented, he mourned, and then he eventually got back up, the scripture says, and he went back into the temple to worship. Now, on the surface, that sounds like, oh, what a good little story little King David did. But underneath the surface, I would say that was probably one of the hardest things King David ever had to do, was to make that first trip back into the temple to worship God without his child. Now, some of you may be in that position as I speak to you today. You have just went back to church, or you're getting ready to start back to church after the death of your loved one. And it's different now. And that's okay that it's different. You see, that's what grief does. Grief makes everything different. It's okay to realize that it's different. C.S. Lewis said that after the death of his wife, he said that her death is like the sky. It covers everything. So here you are, getting up to that moment and getting the nerve to go back into church, and on the surface, it's all the same. Because you're probably parking pretty much in the same position. You're walking into the same building. You're seeing the same faces, and you're singing the same songs. But it's different with you. And that's what grief does. You see, when you go back into church, God's not saying to you, well, now you're getting back to normal. No, you'll never be back to normal. When you go to church, what happens is God's meeting us in our new normal that grief has brought our way. So it's okay that church feels different now. And when you return to church, you're not saying that, well, they're moving on, or I'm moving on. No, you're not moving on when you go back to church. You're leaning on. You're leaning on the everlasting arms of Jesus. That's an old hymn that many churches sing, leaning on the everlasting arms. And when you walk back into that building that first time, or those first few times, man, you're not just leaning on the arms of Jesus, you're leaning on the arms of other brothers and sisters who are in that building. Because when you start looking around that building, you'll realize you're not the only widow, or you're not the only widower. And you're not the only one who is an orphan now, or you're not the only one who has lost a child. Because what you see in that building, once you get inside that assembly, is, man, you can lean on God and you can lean on one another. Olin Hay was an old, experienced preacher, and many times he would come to the college there, and he would stress to us students about some of the ways and some of the things that we should do when we preach and when we minister to people. But he always had this one saying. He'd say, boys, when you preach as if you're preaching to the hurting, because there's a broken heart in every pew. You don't have to be the strongest Christian in the world to go back to church. You don't have to do that. Sometimes your presence, just your presence, it's a great, great act of faith in and of itself. You don't have to sing the loudest. You don't have to smile the brightest. You don't have to explain anything to anybody, because it's not okay. People are, how you doing? I'm doing okay. No, you don't have to do that, because the church is the one place where it's okay not to be okay. Jesus said, come unto me, you that are heavy and weary and burdened down. And you know what he said? I'll give you rest. Come to me and I'll give you rest. And when you go to the church, what you're saying is that God is still writing your story. You see, grief has planted into our hearts and into our minds that it's over. This is the end. But really, God's still writing in the middle chapters of our life. So when we return to church, we're not saying everything's fixed. But what we are saying is we are declaring that we still believe this is where God is, and this is where God's people meet. The psalmist said that you may weep for a night, but joy comes in the morning. And you ever noticed how joy or how morning comes? It just doesn't boom right onto the scene. It slowly works its way into the morning. It does it very slowly, and it does it very faithfully, and it does it day after day after day. So when you go back to church, it's okay not to be okay, because you're not getting back to normal. God's meeting you in your new normal, and you can lean on Him, and you can lean on His people. God bless you, and I hope that you can have a good day.